Chris.
In other words, you wouldn't want, or do I just get on digital?
Lucas. Over this way more. Hi, Marcos.
Where he has a team doing research in virtual actors, virtual environments, and in applying computer graphics to creative projects. We know him at SIGGRAPH from his multiple SIGGRAPH papers and his multiple electronic theater pieces, such as Campanile movie, Fiat Lux, etc. He holds a degree in math and computer engineering from University of Michigan and a PhD in computer science from Berkeley. I met Paul in 1999 while being the producer of the Electronic Theater. We were stuck in a room at ILM screening about 600 tapes going through the jurying process. Paul was one of the jurors. 2 years ago that was, and here we are now. Paul, please take it away.
Adjust the microphone. Your height. It's turned off to allow you to.
All right, so just right up here. How does that look?
It looks fine. It's good. Go ahead and lock down.
Hi.
Good sound.
So I'm going to be talking about digital cinematography, and this encompasses a lot of work that's going on in the graphics group I'm involved with at the Institute for Creative Technologies. This is work done by a large number of people, a number of whom we have right here in the audience tonight. I'll mention a couple of names of the people who have written some of these programs: Jonathan Cohen, Marcos Fajardo, Tim Hawkins, and Chris Chu, as well as with help from all of the other people in our graphics laboratory, and Bobby Halliday, who's made it possible in a lot of ways for us to have everything set up here today. So cinematography, one of the things that it means is about the physics of the camera, like where you put the camera, what lens you decide to put on it, how you decide to move it through a scene. But cinematography also means lighting, and in fact, if you get into the deeper aspects of cinematography and the subtleties, all of them are about lighting. They have to do with where do you put the lights in the scene? How do you bounce them off of different surfaces in order to make the light reach the actors? And then how do you expose them into digital images or film images in the camera, and all of the choices you can make with filters and gels and all of those things. Computer graphics has been great for doing those first aspects of cinematography. You can put any camera anywhere and move it anywhere that you would like, anyhow that you would like to do it. But to do the lighting, it's been a lot of much more challenging because traditional computer graphics techniques don't simulate light the way that light really works. And in fact, traditional digital images aren't even able to record real light levels the ways that they exist in the real world. So I'm going to show a couple of programs that we've been developing that are designed to hopefully make it a little bit closer to being able to deal with real aspects of real light in computer graphic situations, and then hopefully being able to do things that are more realistic and, in terms of leveraging artistry, to have artists be able to spend more time trying to get what they want rather than to try to get things to look real. So the first thing that I'd like to show is a program that's been developed by Chris Chu and with help from Tim Hawkins and a bit of input from myself, called HDR Show. And I'll just go over here. It's named a little bit after Photoshop. That's the shop part, but the HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. I'll show you in a minute what that generally means. I'm going to load in a traditional digital image here. This is a picture in Memorial Church in Stanford, which is a lovely place, and we've taken just a traditional picture on film, scanned it to photo CD. The first thing that it asks you whenever you load a picture is, what is the response curve that generated that picture? One of the things that's problematic in digital images is that you get pixel values from 0 to 255, but you don't really know what they mean in terms of actual amounts of light. Does a pixel value of 128 mean there's twice as much light as a pixel value of 64? In most cases, not, and there's a variety of different encodings, like for example, exponential and different gamma curves. Let's load this one up, and we'll tell the computer that it has a particular gamma curve. And then it will know linearly how to map pixel values to light levels, and thus it will turn this into an actual floating point image with arbitrary light levels in it. That actually is designed to have linear light levels. So if internally it says a pixel value is twice as great as another, it really means it's twice as much light. Now this is of course just one single picture, and even though it's been exposed pretty well for this particular scene, you'll notice that if you look into this region here, it's kind of blown out. You can't really see any of the detail. And if you look into this region over here, it's quite dark. You can't see any detail in here either. One thing you could do is just try to darken the image, for example, doing something like this, but that doesn't bring any of the detail back. And you also might run into trouble if you try to just brighten the image up over here to try to get some detail in this dark region. It doesn't really do much for you there either. So one of the algorithms that you can use, if you want to try to recover all of that, is to actually take a whole series of pictures from dark exposures to bright exposures. And this program is designed to be able to let you do that. So if we just start in with this image series, I think the pictures here go from 30-second exposure inside the cathedral to 1,000th of a second exposure inside the cathedral. And this one is obviously overexposed, and some of the first ones here we'll see are actually rather underexposed. But we can go and assemble them, compile a high dynamic range image out of all of these, to turn them into a single image that has floating point pixel values that actually has that complete range of illumination in the scene. Let's take a look at it. I'll just bring this up. You'll see now we have a digital image where we can look at just about any part of the scene and move around. And if we want to try to see what's actually in that window, we can expose it down and actually take a look at the stained glass window. And in fact, if you want to go over here and look up into these dark rafters, you can expose it up and actually see what's going on in the rafters, which is pretty exciting. Now, down here in the lower right, it's actually showing how many times I've hit the plus and minus keys to re-expose the image. And it actually re-exposes the image by an entire factor of 2 every time I hit plus or minus. So when I was looking over here and getting that nicely exposed, we're actually at 16 f-stops above where we loaded it in at. Now if we look at this bright region over here, get that exposed nicely, we're actually at 1 f-stop above. So that's a total of 15 f-stops difference. And that means that there's 15 factors of 2, or 32,000. So we're actually re-exposing this image up and down by a factor of 32,000 as we're moving it here. Now this is a nice thing if you're going to try to do any kinds of image processing operations like changing the color balance or doing various kinds of motion blurs and such. Let me save off a copy of this image right now and just do a duplicate. And we'll bring it up to about here. One of the things that we can do, obviously just on a single video monitor, you can only show the limited dynamic range that a video monitor can show, even if underlying is all of that other dynamic range. One of the things you can do is do things like a motion blur. So if we were to take the function here to do a horizontal motion blur, let's say maybe 100 pixels wide, that's a pretty wide blur, you can actually see that these windows will leave these bright streaks across the image. And they wouldn't do that if you didn't actually know how bright those pixels were. So we can get those effects to be correct. Another thing that's very important is if you're using cameras to record light, and one of the things we've done a lot of work with is going out into the real world, recording what the light is like in the real world, and then using that to illuminate synthetic objects. What we typically tend to do is to take pictures of, for example, mirrored balls. That's a quick way to get an omnidirectional image that looks in all directions. This one was taken in Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and it has a similar dynamic range as the Memorial Church image we just saw. And this is very interesting because it is a record of, for every direction out there in the world, what is the true intensity and color of the illumination coming from that direction. And we'll see in a moment that you can use that to illuminate synthetic objects. HDR Show, since one of the things we want to do are manipulating these lighting measurements, has a lot of innate functionality for converting between different high dynamic range formats. So for example, our panoramic formats. So for example, we can go from this particular format to a more traditional omnidirectional image format, such as a cube map. Let's see here. That one looks good. And let's do about, let's type in pixel values so this comes out sized about right. So now we've remapped that omnidirectional image into a cube map. And this is one of my favorite things to do with church images, is to put them out into the form of a cross. And that's also, besides being consistent with Christian symbolism, the kind of image that loads conveniently into computer graphics hardware in order to do environment maps on objects. Now, one of the problems is that traditional computer graphics hardware for their texture maps are 8-bit as well, low dynamic range images. So how can we take one of these high dynamic range images, where we can re-expose it dynamically, and put it into a actual real-time computer graphics application? Well, here's a program written by Chris Chu, and some work that was also done by Jonathan Cohen and Tim Hawkins, that does just that. This is an interactive viewer that actually has a high dynamic range texture map. This is actually a very fine level light probe image that we took in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. This is one of the environments in our movie Fiat Lux. And what we'll be able to do is interactively move around in this scene. We're running a GeForce 2 card here. And you'll notice as we look into the darker regions of the scene, we'll actually dynamically re-expose so we can see into these shadow regions. And these columns here on the left and right are actually kind of blown out. But as we move back, it'll dynamically re-expose it down. Now this is all happening in real time in the graphics hardware. And the way that it's done, with the algorithm that Jonathan and Chris worked on, is to split the texture into multiple 8-bit texture maps and then use the texture combiners to dynamically re-expose them according to an arbitrary exposure value. You can actually look up into the sky here and actually see some of the detail in the sky. Now, as it turns out, in the real world, everything has this high dynamic range in it. It's actually very rare that you can take a photograph anywhere in the real world and have it neatly fall between the 0 to 255 of low dynamic range images that we're traditionally accustomed to. So I think that there will be a lot of applications for this kind of technology in any kind of virtual reality application or a game where you want the graphics to look very realistic, as you can move from different parts of the scene where it's very bright or very dark and watch your eyes naturally re-expose as you move to the different scenes. Now, I mentioned also that these high dynamic range images are useful for lighting synthetic objects. And you can even do this by going back to some of the tradition of environment mapping with some objects in real time in this situation. So let's bring up the standard computer graphics object here. Yay! The teapot. And now we can actually, instead of a perfect shiny silver teapot, actually change what this thing's reflectance value is, all the way from a completely physically impossible perfect mirror to a rather dark onyx shape. And when we actually do that, you can look into the reflection that we have in the teapot and actually see the clouds and things like that. Even though we've taken that image, and if I fix the exposure right here and look up into the sky, you'll see the sky is just completely blown out. We can actually look into the teapot, and that's that same texture map being mapped there in real time, and see the detail in the sky. Another thing that HDR Shop lets us do is pre-convolve these environment maps to produce diffuse environment maps. That's the environment map that roughly approximates what it would look like if you had a diffuse object in the scene rather than a shiny object in the scene. What it does is it does a cosine-weighted convolution of every direction to show what a Lagrangian surface would reflect in any particular orientation. And that truly requires having those high dynamic range values, because essentially you're taking a big blur of the image, and as we saw, it's important when blurring to have the full range of light values. So let's turn off the shiny teapot for a second and put in this diffuse teapot. And hopefully this thing looks like it's really being lit by the light that's actually there. It doesn't look strangely shaded or anything like that. Because actually it is this same environment that we have back here that's been convolved to produce the diffuse reflection that's lighting it. Now, of course, you might want to try to also put a gloss layer on this. So if we put these two things on here, then we can actually show what the teapot would look like, both with the gloss and with the diffuse reflection. Now here I have to put a caveat, which is that we're not actually doing this quite correctly, because we're doing this addition in the frame buffer. And the frame buffer has these gamma-corrected pixel values. It's designed to be seen on a monitor that's going to apply a gamma 2.2 curve, a nonlinear mapping of the values in the frame buffer to the values on the monitor, the light levels. And unfortunately, because frame buffers are only 8-bit and because they're non-linearly encoded, you can't just do this addition in the frame buffer. So the specular reflection and the diffuse reflection aren't quite in the right ratios toward each other. Now, if you look at this here, you'll actually notice a couple of things aren't happening correctly. If you look under the handle here, you'll see that the handle actually, you should be seeing a reflection right about here of the handle in the teapot, these self-interreflections. And again, since we're doing this in real time with these pre-convolved maps, we're not getting that kind of stuff for free. We're not getting those calculated correctly. So instead, what we can do is actually go to some offline rendering algorithms that use global illumination to simulate the light falling on these objects. So I'm going to close these two applications and go back to some offline renderings here. Here we go. So the basic idea is that if you have a CG model of an object, you just place that in the middle of the scene, and then if you have one of these high dynamic range omnidirectional images, you apply some kind of mapping function to get that mapped on a large sphere surrounding the object. And with a suitable global illumination algorithm, you can actually simulate all of that light falling on the objects. Another alternative approach is to break this incident sphere of illumination into a whole bunch of tiny light sources, and then simulate that just being lit in a traditional way. Preferably using shadows and bounce light and such. But if you have a render that doesn't support that, then you can still get the first approximation of what it would look like to have that light illuminating the objects. Now, one of the things we've been able to do with the help of Marcos Fajardo, who's the author of the Arnold rendering system, who's working in our group, is to actually illuminate these things using a very advanced Monte Carlo rendering situation to take synthetic objects and illuminate them with these measurements of real light and get all of the correct interactions of the light and the objects. So here are a couple of renderings that we've done with that. This is from a light probe image taken near sunset on the UC Berkeley campus, and these are all synthetic objects here. Different reflectance properties from different specular shines and diffuse balls and such, and you get the correct reflections and such. I showed you that Grace Cathedral image a little earlier where we have all those stained glass windows up toward the top. One of the things that's amazing about these algorithms is they actually simulate the light coming from the windows, focusing through the ball, and then causing pools of focused light on the table. Those are called caustics. And that's what we've got right here. So this is, again, another completely synthetic image that we were able to compute with this. And hopefully it looks a little bit more realistic than we would traditionally get if we just put a couple of CG lights around there. Because we're illuminating it with a very complex, spatially varying, truly measured from the real world measure of incident illumination coming from everywhere. This is a set of objects here that are showing various forms of caustics here from the inside of this ring, and various kinds of shadows and such. And this is a glass object. And this is actually illuminated from the kitchen light probe. All of these light probes are available on my website, and along with the high dynamic range image viewer if you want to play with them. This particular one is actually the first light probe image that I took, and it's in my kitchen back when I lived at Berkeley. And this image was particularly interesting for me because I actually, just looking at these things, I never had these objects on my table, but it actually gave me the feeling of the quality of the illumination of really actually being in that kitchen that I haven't been in for a while. We have one more rendering here. One of the things that Marcos does is he works with a small team of digital artists around the world who test out his software, and every couple of days he gets an email, usually around 2 a.m., that is one of the renderings that they've done with it. And there's a fellow in Washington named, I know his nickname, but he did this image. Here it is. Gary Butcher. And this is again illuminated by the light in my kitchen, and it's a gorgeous model that he's put together. And then if you were to look closely, this is the light probe image that we have, and if you were to look closely in the top here, you can actually see the light on the ceiling and the windows and the teapots and cabinets and such. And so again, you're getting a somewhat more realistic computer graphics image because the light's coming from everywhere and it's being simulated correctly. So we've sort of gotten good techniques for illuminating synthetic objects with real light, and that's certainly something that helps out in the basic idea of doing digital cinematography. One of the very important things we also need to do is figure out how can we illuminate real people, the actors that are going to be in these films, with measurements of real light. And one of the reasons that we can do it with a synthetic object is that a computer can, for any particular direction that light is coming from, simulate what that object would look like by just doing a rendering, casting rays and such, to generate an image of what it looks like with light coming from that direction. And then by simulating the light coming from all the different directions and summing those, it produces the image that we've got here. So if we want to illuminate a real person with light that's coming from everywhere, something that might be helpful is if we know what they actually would look like with light coming from this direction or this direction or this direction. And back at Berkeley, one of the last things that we did there before coming down here to USC was to build just such a contraption to illuminate a person from every possible direction that light can come from. And that was the light stage. This is actually the first version of the light stage, and I'll talk a bit about this one and then show how it led to the design considerations we had for the second one. But this first version of the light stage basically had a single light source, and in fact this is almost nostalgic. It is actually literally the same light source that's illuminating me right now, right up there. It was on a 2-bar mechanism. This is just ABS plastic here. There's a hinge here, and then there's 2 lazy Susans up here. We'll have a close-up of this in a second. So this first bar can rotate around like this, and then the second bar can tilt down like that. This is Chris Chu and Tim Hawkins here, who are operating the light stage. And it's actually completely driven by hand by ropes. And one of the design problems that we had was we had to figure out how are we going to get power to this light source when it's spinning around without the power cord getting all wrapped up around the device. At the same time, we were also wondering, well, given that we probably don't have the chops to put together a motor-driven system that will do anything other than possibly dangerous, how can we actually get the thing to turn around? And we ended up solving both of those problems at the same time by actually running the power cord from the light source down this tube, around over here, up this tube, up the axle, out a little hole in the axle, and then actually wrapping it around the axle so that if you wind the light stage, you can then pull on the power cord to unwind it, and then that actually turns it around. So this is the power cord wound around there. It's in need of rewinding, and it took a few minutes to do that every time. Given the fact that this was entirely driven by ropes, we had some questions as to how well calibrated it was. The thing that lowered the second arm was this ball chain, and it was marked every couple of inches with where the next position was for the light to go down. And we had the idea of taking a long exposure photograph of the light stage to try to see how accurately we were able to run it. And this is the photograph that we got for that. So that's the light starting there at the top and then rotating around until it gets to the bottom. And the idea for this photograph actually came after I sat in the light stage and tried to get recorded with my eyes open. And essentially this is the image that I had left on my retinas for about 10 minutes afterwards. And so I thought that we could just take a picture of that. So, well, once we have that, then the kind of data set that we get is a very useful data set for being able to relight people's faces. This is the kind of light stage that we get. It is a 4-dimensional slice of the 8-dimensional reflectance field, which describes how instant light is transformed into radiant light in this manner. Or more simply, it's just simply a measurement, a data set of how this person looks like with light coming from the front, from the top, from below, let's see here, from the right, from the left, and all around here on the back edge from behind. Now, in order to then show what a person would look like under arbitrary lighting, then we can actually do some relatively simple mathematics by taking one of our light probe images. Suppose we want to show what this fellow is an undergraduate H.P. Diker who worked with us on this project. If we want to show what H.P. would look like illuminated in Grace Cathedral, we can simply take this image, map it into the same data set, the same latitude-longitude data set that we've taken the light stage data in, and then take all of these images of his face, which shows what he looks like with a unit intensity white light source coming from that direction, and then color all of these images according to the intensity and color of the light that was measured in the environment coming from that corresponding direction. So I can show what that looks like here. So we've taken all of those same images and we've made them so that they conform to the same colors in the environment. And this corresponds to just treating individually the light coming from this little spot here and the light coming from that little spot there and the light coming from that little spot there. And as we know in optical compositing, if you want to show what something would look like with more than one light on it, we can add together images of what something would look like with the individual lights on them. And by adding all of these images together, we can actually generate an image of what this fellow would look like illuminated by this environment, even though it was only originally illuminated by white light sources of unit intensity. So these are a couple of different environments. This is the Uffizi environment that we saw the teapot in. This is St. Peter's Basilica that was used in the animation Fiat Lux. This is the UC Berkeley Eucalyptus Grove that was used in the animation render with natural light. And in a moment, I will show actually a real-time implementation of this relighting. That will be our final demo for the night. But since the light stage itself is sort of built in borrowed space, and we had to take it apart within a couple of weeks of putting it together. And so coming down here to USC, there's a lot more work that we want to do with this. Getting three-dimensional scans of faces, turning them into animated characters, starting to explore the spectral characteristics of the light sources and the reflectance of skin. So it seemed like it would be a good idea to actually build a second light stage. And for this one, we really didn't want to have to compromise about, pulling the cords and stuff, because it got pretty laborious to wind it every time. So we actually did go and work with some people who did know how to build motors and bearings and things like that, and designed the second light stage here. And another thing we wanted to do was to be able to capture people quickly. You'll notice all of the light stage 1 renderings are of people usually with their eyes closed, and usually looking extremely stoic, very little evidence of life whatsoever. And that's because they had to stay still for over a minute for that light to go around, which actually was not limited by the speed of the light. It was limited more by the speed of the cameras. We couldn't run the light any faster because the cameras that we were taking the pictures with were only NTSC 30 frame per second cameras. So one of the things that we did was to get some high frame rate cameras and then build the light stage out of a series of strobe lights, actually 32 strobe lights going from the top to the bottom, and put them together on a computer system that can actually fire the strobes exactly when it opens the shutter of the digital camera and record these directly to RAM so we can get uncompressed images rather than the mini DV compressed images we had in the first version. So this is an actual image of the light stage here. This is Tim Hawkins over here, who is principally responsible for getting this thing together, and Chris Chu sitting in the light stage. And just for fun, again, we decided, well, let's try to figure out how well our firing algorithm is working and how does everything work. So this is a 10-second exposure of what the light stage looks like going around. And the lights actually buzz very quickly from the top to the bottom as it goes around. So at this point, what I'd like to do is show our demonstration of actually doing some of this stuff in real time. So if we go over to here, and let's see here, let's hope this starts up nicely. Okay. All right. So we have 3 people here. This is Andrew from SCFX, that's Visual Effects Society at the University of Southern California. We have Christophe Gaury from ILM, who came to visit us one day. And also we have Emily de Groot, who is a very good friend of some of the people in the laboratory here. And what I'm going to do is start out with kind of the simplest version of this thing. I'm going to turn these lights off here. I'll leave that one kind of like that, and I'm going to turn that one off and turn that one off. Basically, this is an application that is designed to allow us to relight the face, as near as possible in real time. So what we can actually do is we have 3 light sources here. Actually, we could have any number of light sources. And as we move the light around, it's playing back the images that we recorded in the light stage. Now you'll see a couple of compression artifacts. We're not using nearly as advanced techniques, I'm sure, as Gary Demos showed us earlier. They're actually based on discrete cosine transforms and such like that, which have some nice properties for doing the lighting calculations, but do introduce artifacts into the system. So you'll see some of those. But basically, this shouldn't be any huge surprise that we're able to, since we recorded what Andrew's face looked like, lit from every one of these directions, that we can then show interactive control over the lighting. Now, it is nice to point out that we are having this control, but we also get all of the bright shadows, the highlights, all of the kind of interesting ways that the light reflects off of the hair and this anisotropic reflection. Just because we're doing this based on real images, it looks real, and all the complexities are reproduced. We can also, and again, this shouldn't be any big surprise at all, show what he would look like under different colored light sources. And that's just obviously done by tinting these images different colors. And that's a completely fair thing in terms of the physics. You can just color the image and it shows what they would look like under different colors of illumination. It also is not hard at all to take Andrew and show what he would look like with 2 light sources. We can just take a second one over here what the computer's going to do is quickly add these two images together. Let me make this one a little bit warmer colored. And now we can play around with a warm colored light over here. And if we want to make this a cooler colored light, we can do that. Get something a little bit dramatic here. And maybe we could try to put a little rim light. Let's make this kind of whitish rim light that we might put behind here to light his hair up or something. And then we can experiment with this. Now, one of the big reasons I actually wanted to play around with this program and worked with Chris and Dan and Tim to write it was that I wanted to learn about lighting faces and what it's like when you put the lights from different directions. If you put lights coming from below, making people look spooky, or giving them lots of backlighting or side lighting and such. And this demo is actually online. I'll put the website up at the end. And if you have any moderate graphics card, there's a very good chance it will run on it. And there's a number of face data sets that you can pull over. Now, there's a couple of other things I just wanted to mention. All of these are done with very close to point light sources. I'm going to turn two of them off here. And we'll just go back to this one here and do that. But we can actually change the diffusion on the light because I can make a very diffused source. You can see that this is a very different quality of illumination than if I make it a very harsh source. And what it's doing here in order to do that is to actually average together lots of those images from being lit from the different directions. And you can simulate a completely different quality of illumination here. Let's look at some other people here. This is Emily. And you'll notice with these light stage 2 data sets, we don't have much problem with people keeping their eyes open and being able to have more natural expressions than we had in the initial light stage. Apologies to Christoph. One of the things that we also do is we actually reproduce the camera flare, the image flare in the original cameras, so you can actually see the flares show up, which might be good if you're really trying to match what that particular camera does. In other cases, might not be as good, so we might want to flag off the lights from getting in there. And then also, we can actually go over and illuminate people by real environments as well. So these are some of those light probe images that we have on our website, and we can just click between different images and see what you look like in Grace Cathedral or the Eucalyptus Grove or the Uffizi Gallery. And we can rotate the lighting environment around like that, or set it going automatically. Now, the way that it's actually able to do this relighting in real time, even though we're essentially lighting the face with 500 directions, is that we're computing all of the lighting in a compressed frequency space. That introduces a little bit of the artifacts that we're seeing. But the way that the calculation actually happens is that we multiply what we call the reflectance function, which we're viewing here in the lower left. As I move around our subject's face, it generates an image that you can see in the lower left, which is how the light reflects off of the face when it's coming from any particular direction. So let me just go right here onto a very simple part here on her cheek. And then what's happening is this is the color that her cheek is when the light is straight on it, coming from straight the same direction as the camera. And as you move around over to here, this is the color that her cheek is when the light is behind her head. Obviously, it falls into shadow. This is the color it is when the light's very high up. And if we actually put the light very high up, then we'll see that the cheek gets pretty dark. Over here. And so what's actually happening is that it's doing the multiplication between this image here, which is the reflectance function, and the lighting environment by multiplying these two images together, taking the sum of them, and then generating the final pixel values. And we're actually computing that in frequency space. We take each one of these and essentially JPEG compress them so that we have an orthonormal set of basis coefficients. We turn it into a much smaller data set. And since it is a transformation that preserves the way that the math works when you add things together and multiply things together, then you're actually able to, on about 1/10 the data, compute what this image times this image is and then add them all together, rather than having to take all of the several hundred images of her face and add them together realistically. So if you download our demo, that is exactly what's going to be going on your PC. So let me head back to PowerPoint for just ending this thing here. So these are some of those reflectance functions that we saw. This is actually kind of a fun image that we had in our SIGGRAPH 2000 paper, which is a whole photo mosaic made up of the reflectance functions of all the different parts of the face. The ones in the ears are the most interesting because when you put the light behind the ear, it still actually shines light coming out from the front because of the translucency. And again, this is how the mathematics works, going from the normalized, from the incident lighting times the reflectance function. You can do that same thing in the compressed space. You can get the same levels of detail. So let me just mention a couple of things if you want to follow up on any of this work. The space demo is available on my website, www.debevec.org. I think that's probably linked off of the LA SIGGRAPH site for this particular event. HDR Shop is something that we are working feverishly on to, before SIGGRAPH, be able to put on the web an executable version of that so you can play around with some high dynamic range images, take them yourself by taking a series of pictures with your digital camera, and then actually using them, for example, in different global illumination programs like Lightwave supports this. Greg Ward's Radiant system that's publicly available from Lawrence Berkeley Labs lets you illuminate synthetic objects with real light. For the high dynamic range texture maps, we have a paper online that we'll be presenting at the Eurographics rendering workshop shortly. At SIGGRAPH 2001 on Sunday in the afternoon, I'll be teaching a course on image-based lighting and teaching a little bit more detail about the nuts and bolts of these things. There'll be a presentation on the Arnold Global Illumination System on Wednesday in a technical sketch. And then there'll be some other technical sketches being given by Tim and Chris and Jamie in our group on the light stage, on HDR Shop, and also a new technique we have for actually getting dynamic lighting environments through a real-time high dynamic range light probe. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone who helped contribute to this, and thank you very much.
We're going to take questions now. If Gary and Bob come back.
Yeah, I got to please take the chairs out.
And yes, we have director's chairs for them.
If you can get a good approximation to the geometry of the face, then perhaps in far fewer lighting directions you'll actually be able to compute relightings of it, which is one of the avenues that we're investigating.
I had a comment that I remember in 1980 or thereabouts at III, gentleman, he just pushing really hard, says, "You got to give me a tool like this that does interactive lighting." And I said, "That's probably pretty hard." So given that it took a few years to do, I think I was vindicated somewhat, but I also think it turned out to look like a pretty useful tool. So he was also vindicated.
More questions?
Gary, if you compress too much, what kind of artifacts do you see?
Oh, don't do it. It's a line which you must not cross. No, actually, that's a really interesting problem, which is that most compression that we see has been turned, the knob has been turned too high on it. And I couldn't believe what I saw in a TV store, a CBS football, through somebody's distribution system. I couldn't believe what I was seeing there. And so part of it is a discipline thing. I was commenting to somebody out in the lobby before that quality never happens by accident. The forces of compromise and expediency and efficiency and economics are always working against quality. So it takes intentional, this is the right bit rate for this at this size and this frame rate. It takes an intentional effort to set things at the right quality level. And there's also something inherent in the image, like if it's a very noisy image, it's going to be harder to compress, it's going to take more bits. If it's a nice, quiet computer graphics image, it might compress really nicely. We found computer graphics images weren't very challenging early on in our research and started going after grainy, yucky stuff, and stuff with a lot of motion, and stuff with a lot of detail sliding over each other. So, but thank you for raising that point, because that's a really key issue in the field of compression is where do you draw the line? And I think the line should be drawn at something very good, because the compression can still be efficient.
Over here.
Getting back to the compression workflow, we were showing uncompressed versus compressed images.
a lot of the cameras that are coming out for digital cinema already are performing a pre-processing compression going in, DV being probably the most popular now. What are we seeing as far as cameras coming out for digital cinema production that reduce the amount of pre-processed compression coming in, so you have something obviously not uncompressed, but maybe like a lossless compression format?
Another very good point. The images that I showed, I was trying to show a variety of material, but I was also showing a variety of cameras and treatments along those lines. The Theoplay Chopin was captured onto a D5 with a 4:1 compression. It's probably the best compression, actually. The D5 was playing the tape of that material. It's a 10-bit dynamic range, very carefully done compression. DV is limited to 8 bits. Some of the New York material and some of the things, the helicopter stuff was shot with a DVHD, DVC Pro HD Panasonic. And we ran a bunch of pre-processing to try and restore some of the picture back. And one of the reasons the bit rates on the New York scene were higher is not just that you have a lot of depth of field and we're seeing sharp from all the way in the very foreground to the far distance, but it was also that our compressor was seeing their compressor, and it was trying very hard to reproduce all those little DCTs, which aren't helping your eye at all because they're not really part of the picture. The counterexample is that Air Show, which was extremely compact. The Air Show was cameras directly into a D5. And we also have done some amount of testing into a disk array, which is the only uncompressed form we've had access to. And that's even more efficient. So to the degree you can get no compression on the way into our compressor, we're better off. Now on the other hand, we've concatenated our compressor with the standard MPEG-2 kind of stuff, and because we're working to a 10-bit noise flow, I don't think we affect them versus an original. So I think what you're mainly looking for is what kind of signal noise or quality level is the compressor working towards. But I think it's going to be an environment, a heterogeneous environment with a lot of variation in this. I'm facing, do I put the camera on my shoulder and live with the 8-bit, or do I run the umbilical back to the D5, or even further back to the disk array kind of question on a regular basis now? And the trade-off of, gee, it fits here and I can walk over there, versus I'm umbilical but I get a better signal. I think that everyone here is going to be facing that.
I have a question. So the mini DV, which we've done a lot of work with, is I think 3.88 megabytes per second. So that would be 30 megabits per second. Okay. From what I understand. And you were showing stuff at taking up the whole screen at 9 megabits per second, right? Which is like, yeah, which is less. That's pretty good.
Yeah, the DV I think is about 25 for standard definition DV. And it's people have gotten an awful lot out of that. I don't mean to demean these compression systems. I think they've made a lot of practical value. There was a debate 7 or 8 years ago about should compression ever be used in production equipment. And I think the Ampex DST or DCT was like the first. It was using a D2 format to store D1 of a 2-to-1 compression. And then when digital Betacam came in, again about 2-to-1 compression, that became popular immediately. So I think that question went away. People have been using small amounts of compression in production since that point in time. And I think that the potential now is we can use much larger amounts of compression in production. And what that can allow us to do is to push the frame rate up or the resolution. I mean, this is just today's technology. I mean, we'd like to go further, certainly.
My question is for Paul. Greg Panos here. What are your thoughts for the future in the exercise that you've been going through in developing Light Stage 2? It looks like your form is beginning to follow function and reduce its complexity and its configuration. Considering three-dimensional data acquisition of human forms, which is an area that I've looked closely at, I've seen many different kinds of three-dimensional scanners of various configurations, some that work in a linear fashion, some that work in a circular fashion. I haven't seen any that have worked in a spiral fashion, but the way that your Light Stage 2 acquires various light points is roughly a spiral configuration. Do you see any developments whereby a dovetailing of design of three-dimensional acquisition systems would benefit from relative compatibilities in the designs that you're evolving right now, whereby during the optical image lighting surface acquisition, the three-dimensional measurements and quantization and range finding information is acquired simultaneously at each sample point. So it isn't a two-step process using two dissimilar technologies, but they're integrated into one scan session. And also, the second part of the question is, what do you think the sort of limit on speed of acquisition time will eventually evolve to become? Basically not being knocked over by the thing because it moves so fast, or the amount of wind that it blows and messes up your hair with as it spins by you, or do you think the whole thing will be solid state at some point?
Let's see. Well, to answer a bit of the second question, so light stage 2 can actually go at 40 RPM, and the arm weighs about 300 pounds. We've only done that once before freaking all of us out pretty badly. Let's see. Well, you can take a look at the speed of cameras. We're really limited by the speed at which we can record things with the cameras. We're going to be getting a new camera in that goes slightly over 250 frames per second that we'll be able to take light stage data with. That should get our capture time down to just a couple of seconds. That hopefully will make the difference between being able to do a very natural, happy smile. We'd love to get a natural, happy smile that we can relight, rather than just, the best people can really do is to manage to look pleasant, which is a lot better than light stage 1, actually. The things that we think a lot about are like, what kinds of lighting can't you do by recombining these images in the light stage? One thing that you can't do are like film noir effects, where you want to just show a bar of light across the eyes and you have the rest of the light be in relative shadow. Certainly one thing that you could do is just light different parts, different pixels on the face differently according to different incident lighting, but that won't actually reproduce all of the right global illumination effects. If you want to simulate what a person would look like with just a bright ray of light just hitting them on the cheek here, and you just lit that according to bright light, then you see that skin bright, and the rest of the face, if you rendered it in black, the entire rest of the face would be black, whereas in reality, if you actually took a person and blasted them with a little piece of light here, first of all, the light would bleed over because of the subsurface scattering in the skin, and you wouldn't simulate that. And secondly, there would be interreflections within the face itself. It would light the top of the brow a little bit, and maybe even give a really cool effect that you'd like to capture. We looked a little bit at what the ultimate version of this light stage data set would be. Right now we're recording 4-dimensional data sets where we have a 2-dimensional array of lighting directions, and then for each one of these we take one 2-dimensional image. We saw in the light field work out of Stanford and Microsoft that if you want to simulate what people would look like from all of the other directions, you might take a 2-dimensional array of 2-dimensional images of them, by basically putting cameras at every single point that you put the light sources. And they've actually started to design some cameras that are working towards that, and that would start producing a 6-dimensional data set, 2D of light, and then recording the 4-dimensional spray of radiance coming off of the face for every one of these light directions. But to truly get this right, you'd actually, instead of a light source, you'd have to put a video projector at every one of these positions and then alternately light up every single pixel to record what the face looks like with this ray of light hitting it, and this ray of light hitting it, and this ray of light hitting it. That would then be a 2-dimensional array of light being projected from a 2-dimensional array of incident lighting directions, giving you total with the incident light and the radiant light an 8-dimensional data set, which is what we call the reflectance field. And those aren't going to be practical for a long time, but what's interesting about that is that if you had this 8-dimensional data set, essentially what spray of 4-dimensional light comes off of the face from any particular one of the 4-dimensional space of rays coming in on it, is that you could render a person's face under any form of incident illumination, dappled light, partial shadow, seen from any direction, rendered into any scene, without knowing the slightest bit about what the person's geometry is. And we've also noticed that one of the common geometry recovery techniques, which is structured lighting, where you take a video projector, put a series of stripes on the face to get the geometry, starts looking a lot like what I just talked about, where you're putting a video projector at all these sources and sampling how these generate reflected light from the incident light. So we're trying to think about this really hard, and hopefully at some point it'll all make a lot of sense to us, and then we can go and write a SIGGRAPH paper about it. But I think that you're very much onto something, that there is kind of a unity between the geometry sensing techniques and these lighting sensing techniques that we're working on.
You think it'll be more of a structured light-based approach, or laser interferometry? Interferometry. I have trouble with that one.
Yeah. Well, structured light is great just because in a logarithmic number of patterns, like 10 or 20 patterns, you can get the full geometry of the face, and it works with standard video projectors, which are what we have laying around. Some of these more advanced geometry scanning techniques are neat because you can actually think about recording the geometry of a live performance as a person acts through a scene. And, if we have a chance to work with some of that, we'd love to try it out.
This is a question for Paul. They have 3D body scanners that use white light now. Is there any thought to make a combination system?
I think that would be really interesting to take a combination of range scans and also recording incident light and how the face reflects light or how the body reflects light at the same time. And that's actually one of our research directions that we want to be able to do. We've done a little bit of work in our paper from last year on that to get a scan of the face and then generate renderings of the face from different directions, not by actually having taken pictures from those directions, but by using the geometry to project images on, resynthesize the specular and diffuse components coming from other areas. What I think in the near term would be practical to use things with standard rendering systems would be to actually do an analysis of how the light reflects off of the face, get a diffuse texture map or albedo map, the percentage of light that's reflected in each of the red, green, and blue channels for any particular lighting direction, and figure out what a standard texture map would be, a standard specular map would be, and a standard specular roughness map, and then feed those into traditional local illumination algorithms. There's some very interesting work that's going to be at SIGGRAPH this year, coming out of Stanford, Henrik von Jensen, Pat Hanrahan, Mark Lavoie and company, about an efficient rendering algorithm that simulates the subsurface scattering within stone or within skin. There'll be a very exciting piece in the SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater about that. I think hybridizing that kind of rendering scheme with the kind of measurements that we can take about how the light scatters within the skin and what the actual texture maps are for the skin can produce a very practical model that can be used in traditional rendering systems that hopefully would have very realistic skin and really look like the real people that you've scanned.
More questions? I gotta get somebody in the back. Somebody.
This question is for Paul. At what point do you think in the future that these tools will be in common use by filmmakers so that they're as common as like 3D animation and modeling and rendering tools are today?
So we're trying to get that to happen as quickly as possible. One of the things I've been very happy about is some people at some of the visual effects companies have offered to do some beta testing of our HDR Show program and given us lots of suggestions of how can we make this practical for production. And one of the things in terms of using high dynamic range images is to have high dynamic range image file formats. I mean, a JPEG, a TIFF, a BMP. All of these things traditionally can only hold images that go between black and white is whatever the white is on your monitor, and there's no thought about there being any values that are brighter than that. These are actually starting to come into use. There's been some really nice things like the Nuke compositor that's done a digital domain by Bill Spitzak. Has a native floating point image format that it can send high dynamic range or any kind of image through. So they're using that in production already. They've played around with HDR Show, used it on some commercial projects. And doing the lighting, the kinds of ways of illuminating synthetic objects with real light, Lightwave 6 and 6.5 have implemented that directly from the SIGGRAPH 98 paper. There's also been a number of projects that people have done to get it to work in traditional renderers like Lightwave 5.5 or even RenderMan, just by breaking up these measurements of light, these spheres of incident light, into lots of light sources. And that's the work of like Andy Lesniak and Sean Cunningham. Josh Colden did some work for the Digital James Brown project to animate James Brown's face a digital version of it in real lighting environments by doing a lot of pre-convolutions of the things for the specular reflections and the diffuse reflections. I think that basically the visual effects companies are going to be important in trying these things out, figuring out the little tweaks that make them really work in production. The people who are writing the graphics software will take notice of those projects and then find a way of implementing them in their own products. The light stage itself, that's kind of more on the theoretical end of things. You can definitely download it and run it on your own computer if you want to play around with it. But we're really, in terms of computer graphics right now, very much in a surfaces plus reflectance properties plus global illumination simulation framework, not in a you've got a certain volume and light goes in and light comes out, the reflectance field kind of idea. And it'll probably take a long time to move towards that, just like we haven't really seen the original light field work, which was presented in '96, take off in commercial production. But at the same time, it's given us new ways to think about all of these problems that have made it possible to do a lot of the updates to the commercial stuff.
We've got one last question back here, near those seats that Jack Warner likes to sit in, I've heard.
This is a multi-part question, but if you start with a film, when you're finishing the film, what is like the scanning rate? Is it 2K or 4K to get to the projection? And then once you get to the projection, when you compress it, how long does that take to do? And do you have the state-of-the-art now where you can ship it to a theater? And when they project it, how's the image, what is the quality of that? What does it take to download that and watch that?
I take it you're interested in the actual specs of resolution and such. The film is defined not with a specific number of pixels, but with what they call a modulation transfer function, which is a degree of reproduction of white-black pairs based on size on the image. Films have been moving from the 50 line pairs per millimeter up to 100 line pairs per millimeter, and even beyond for the intermediate films for some number of years. If you look at the number of millimeters across a 35 image using with the soundtrack, it's in the low 20s. So if you have 50 line pairs per millimeter, that's 100 lines. So that's 2,000 some odd. Back in the III days, we used that and said, let's have 3,000 across the frame or 2,500 at digital productions. The films have gotten better in the last 10 years, and the 100 line pairs guys are looking at 4K and 6K, and I think most people in this room have seen that there is detail on a 4K scan that isn't reproduced on a 2K scan. The projector you're seeing here is 1280 wide by 1024 tall. I used non-anamorphic flat lens here, so we actually only had 720 approximately tall. So you weren't seeing a very high pixel count, especially compared to film. One of our projects is to put a pair of these together, use the full height on each, and have essentially a 2.5:1 aspect ratio widescreen, and thereby have 2.5 million pixels. This is 1.25, to try and explore, with available technology, how good would that be? I think we're seeing something that I have not ever expected with this micromirror technology, which is that a relatively modest pixel count by the standards of the high-def production, or beyond high-def production industry that many people here are involved in, that these low pixel counts can look this good. And I think that's partly a reflection of the distribution copying process in regular standard film. In the case of that piano production, once we hit that first A to D converter, that was digital all the way out through the mirrors that were modulating the light. So an entirely digital path after the initial A to D converter at the camera. And the picture shows it. The picture shows the absence of those analog digital iterations. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's a space where it's a moving target. I'm expecting resolutions to go up. I'm expecting that in both cameras and projectors. I don't know how fast it'll happen, but I think we've learned an awful lot with the technology we have today, and it's been a very productive, say, 3 or 4 years this last few years, with both cameras and projectors. And we're not ready to go into every theater yet, but that's just a simple matter of exercise up to the reader.
Thank you, Gary Demas. Thank you, Paul Debevec. Round of applause, please. Thank you, one and all, on the Digital Cinema Lab side, on the SIGGRAPH side, everyone who helped make this meeting a reality. See you at the Convention Center, week of